Diane, we need to end this. I have had the papers drawn up. Everything is fair. The attorneys have reviewed both sides.
The papers were already on the table when she walked in. Diane Whitfield didn't know what she was looking at, not at first. She thought it was a bill, maybe a mortgage statement, maybe something from the homeowners association about the gutters. She almost smiled when she reached for them, the way you smile at something small and ordinary before it detonates in your hands. But Roland didn't smile. Roland Mercer was standing by the window on the far side of the kitchen with his arms folded across his chest and his jaw set in a way she had never quite seen before. And when she looked up at him, really looked, the way you look at someone when something in the room has shifted without explanation, she saw something in his face that stopped her cold. It wasn't anger. It wasn't guilt. It was something that had already decided, something that had made its peace long before she walked through that door. She looked back down at the papers. The word divorce was printed at the top in clean, official black type, and the room started tilting. "Roland," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended, like it had already sensed what was coming and retreated. He didn't move from the window. He didn't look away. And in a voice that was quiet and level and completely devoid of apology, he said two words that would mark the exact boundary between the life she had built and the one she was about to be forced to find. "Sign them." Just like that. No build-up. No trembling hands. No searching her face for a reaction. The way you'd ask someone to pass the remote. And Diane Whitfield stood in her own kitchen, in the home she had helped choose, in the life she had helped construct, and she felt something inside her go completely, terrifyingly still. She started crying. Not the loud, gasping kind, the quiet kind. The kind that happens when your body understands something your mind is still in the process of refusing to accept. Her hands shook as she turned the first page. And then she saw it. His signature. Already there. Clean and certain and dated 3 days prior. Which meant that Roland Mercer had sat in an attorney's office somewhere across town, read every word of these documents, signed his name, and driven home to their shared life. All without her knowing a single thing about it. She asked him why. He told her. And the name that came out of his mouth. The name of the person he was choosing over her. The person he had decided was worth destroying 19 years of friendship and 11 years of marriage for. That name didn't just hurt her. It dismantled her. Because it wasn't a stranger. It wasn't some woman from a work conference she had never met. It was Tasha. Tasha Bloom. Her best friend since 7th grade. Diane Whitfield signed those divorce papers that same night. Alone, at the kitchen table, with tears falling quietly onto the pages and no one in the room to witness it. She signed them because she had nowhere left to stand. She signed them because fighting felt like being asked to win a game where someone else had already changed all the rules. And she signed them because somewhere deep in the part of her that had always been the most practical, the most patient, the most methodical, she knew, even then, that this was not the end of her story. It was simply the end of a chapter. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that in exactly 72 hours, the entire architecture of what Roland Mercer thought he had won was about to collapse. And it was going to collapse in the most precise, the most irrevocable, and the most quietly devastating way imaginable. This is the story of Diane Whitfield. And everything, absolutely everything, that came after she put down that pen. Before we go any further into this story, we want to pause for just a moment and ask, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand what happened to Diane Whitfield, you have to understand who she was before Roland Mercer ever entered her life. And more importantly, you have to understand the one relationship, quiet, consistent, and almost entirely invisible to the people around her, that would ultimately determine everything. Diane Whitfield was born and raised in Dayton, Ohio, the second of 3 children in a family that was stable without being wealthy. Her father, Robert Whitfield, worked for 26 years as a claims adjuster at an insurance firm. Her mother, Linda, taught 3rd grade at a public elementary school for most of Diane's childhood and part of her adolescence. They were the kind of family that paid their bills on time, owned their home without embarrassment, took one modest vacation each summer, and put all 3 of their children through Ohio State universities without taking on debt, which, in the Whitfield household, was spoken about with the same quiet pride that other families reserved for athletic trophies. They were responsible people, careful people, people who understood the difference between appearing wealthy and actually being secure, and who chose security every single time. Diane was the middle child, and she carried the temperament that middle children sometimes develop: the observer, the absorber, the one who reads the room before she reads the menu. She was not the loudest person in any space she occupied, but she was almost always the most attentive. Her younger brother Marcus used to say that telling Diane a secret was the safest thing you could do because she treated every piece of information about a person like something precious, something to be kept carefully, not spent carelessly. Teachers described her as focused. Classmates described her as kind. And the few people who were close enough to know her well described her as someone who felt things deeply but displayed them selectively, which, as it turned out, would become one of the most important qualities she possessed when the worst moment of her life arrived. She met Tasha Bloom in the 7th grade, during a particularly unremarkable Tuesday afternoon in a middle school hallway in Dayton, Ohio, and within a month they were inseparable in the way that certain childhood friendships are, instantly, organically, as if they had simply been waiting to find each other. Tasha was everything Diane was not, in all the right ways. Tasha was loud. Tasha was performative in the best sense. She could walk into a room and shift its entire emotional temperature in under a minute. She was funny and quick and fearless in social situations that made Diane quietly grateful to be standing slightly to the left of her. They balanced each other the way good friendships always do, not by being the same, but by covering each other's edges. Tasha made Diane laugh harder than anyone. Diane made Tasha feel heard in a way that no one else quite managed. By the time they graduated high school, people treated them as a unit. You invited one, you invited both. You knew one, you knew something about the other. They were, to everyone who watched them, the definition of a friendship that was simply going to last. They went to the same university, lived in adjacent dormitory rooms their freshman year, and navigated the particular chaos of early adulthood side by side. The bad relationships and the late-night phone calls and the years of figuring out who they were going to be. Tasha studied communications and landed in marketing. Diane studied business administration and found that she had a genuine, almost instinctive feel for finance, for the logic of how money moved, how assets accumulated, how value could be hidden in things that looked ordinary on the surface. It was a quality she would later describe, in conversations with family members, as something she inherited from her uncle. But we'll come back to him, because Arthur Whitfield is the center of this entire story, even though he never appears in it as a loud presence. He was, in almost every way, the opposite of loud. And that was exactly his point. Roland Mercer entered the picture on a Thursday evening in late October when both Diane and Tasha were 26 years old. He was introduced through a mutual colleague at a professional networking event, the kind of event that most people attend out of obligation and leave 15 minutes earlier than they planned. Roland did not leave early. Roland worked the room with a particular confidence that people who are genuinely good-looking and also know it tend to carry. Not arrogance exactly, more like a settled awareness that he was likely to be received well wherever he directed his attention. He was 30 years old, recently relocated to the Columbus area for a position with a commercial real estate development firm, and he was, by the account of everyone who met him that evening, extremely good company. He was funny without trying too hard. He asked questions that suggested he was actually listening. He had a way of making whoever he was talking to feel like the most interesting person in the room, which is a skill that is either deeply genuine or deeply calculated. And in Roland's case, it was difficult, for a long time, to know which. He showed interest in both women that evening. This is not speculation. Multiple people who were present have confirmed it. Tasha received his attention first, for perhaps 20 minutes near the beginning of the event. She was engaging and magnetic as she always was, and Roland seemed genuinely entertained by her. But then he was redirected, by whom, no one remembers clearly, and he ended up in a corner near the window talking to Diane for the last 45 minutes of the event. And something in that corner, in that 45 minutes, shifted the trajectory of several lives. Tasha, for reasons she would never fully explain to anyone, stepped back from Roland's interest after that evening. She told Diane she thought he was nice, but not her type. Diane was less certain about her own feelings. She described him later as someone who had made her feel seen, which was a word she did not use often, and which meant something significant when she did. They exchanged numbers before the event ended. They had dinner the following week. They were in a relationship before the end of the month. Diane and Roland dated for a year and a half, carefully, and for the most part happily. Roland was ambitious in the way that people in commercial real estate development tend to be, which meant he was always looking at the horizon and calculating what was there, which was exciting when it aligned with the people he loved and isolating when it didn't. But in those early years, he was present. He was attentive. He remembered the things Diane told him. He showed up for the things that mattered. He met her family, including her Uncle Arthur, at a dinner at Diane's parents' home when they had been dating for about 8 months. And he shook Arthur's hand with the warmth of someone who understood he was being assessed, and he said what he was supposed to say. He told Arthur he thought Diane was remarkable. Arthur looked at him for a long moment, the way Arthur looked at everyone, and said very little in return, which, as the people who knew Arthur well would have recognized, was itself a kind of answer. They married in September, in a ceremony that Diane later described as the best day she had experienced to that point. Not for the event itself, but for the feeling underneath it. The feeling that she had chosen correctly, that the life she was entering was one worth entering. Roland looked at her at the altar with an expression that every woman who attended that wedding would describe, in the years after everything fell apart, as the thing they kept coming back to. Not because it was false, but because it appeared, at the time, to be completely real. Tasha was the maid of honor. She cried during the vows, the kind of tears that come from genuine happiness for someone you love, and everyone in that room believed that was exactly what they were. There was no reason, in September of that year, to believe anything else. There was no reason to look at the three of them standing at the front of that ceremony, Roland, Diane, and Tasha just to the left, and see anything except what was there on the surface. A husband, a wife, a best friend, a beginning. Now, before we continue, there is someone you need to understand completely, because without him, nothing that follows makes sense. Arthur Whitfield was Robert Whitfield's older brother by 7 years, and he was, in almost every external way, unremarkable. He was a quiet man. He drove a 12-year-old American sedan. He lived in the same 3-bedroom house in a modest Columbus neighborhood that he had purchased in 1987 for reasons that were practical rather than aspirational. He cooked most of his own meals. He wore the same style of corduroy jacket in various shades of brown for most of his adult life, replacing each one only when it could no longer be credibly described as functional. He did not own a boat. He did not take lavish vacations. He did not collect art or wine or anything that could be described as a trophy. He was, to anyone who encountered him casually, simply a quiet older man who seemed to live comfortably and asked good questions. But Arthur Whitfield had started buying real estate in 1981, when he was 23 years old, with a small inheritance from his own father and an instinct that most people who worked in the industry for decades never quite develop. The instinct for which properties, in which corridors, at which moment in time, were worth more than anyone was currently willing to say out loud. He bought his first building, a small commercial property in a transitional neighborhood in Columbus, at a price that everyone around him at the time thought was foolish. 5 years later, the neighborhood had shifted and the property had tripled in value. He did not sell it. He borrowed against it and bought 2 more. He repeated this process with a patience and a precision that was almost scientific. By 1995, he held properties across Columbus. By 2003, he had expanded into Kentucky and Tennessee. By 2010, the portfolio was larger than anyone in his immediate family knew or would have guessed, because Arthur did not discuss it. He had a rule about that. He believed that discussing wealth was the most reliable way to lose it, not because money was embarrassed by attention, but because the people around money became strange when they knew it was there. He loved Diane. He had always loved Diane, from the time she was a small girl who sat next to him at family dinners and asked him questions about how things worked, how buildings were valued, how neighborhoods changed, how you could tell when something invisible was about to become visible. He had recognized in her, early, the same quality he had in himself. Not genius, exactly, but patience. The ability to let time do what impatience refuses to allow. He called her every Sunday. He attended her graduation, her wedding, every significant moment she invited him to. He shook Roland's hand at the wedding and said, "Take care of her," in a tone that was not a suggestion. And when, In the years of the marriage, Arthur's health began to decline. Quietly, as everything in Arthur's life proceeded, he updated his will with the same precision he had applied to every transaction across 3 decades. He updated it 3 times after Diane's wedding. Each time, the language around the primary beneficiary remained exactly the same. Diane Whitfield, by name, with explicit legal separation from any marital claim. His attorney, a careful man who had worked with Arthur for over 20 years, once asked him whether he wanted to add Roland to any portion of the estate. Arthur considered the question for a moment. Then he said no, and he did not explain further. But he did, on that same visit, write a private letter to his attorney, a letter that would not be read aloud until it needed to be, and in that letter, Arthur Whitfield put into words what he had never said directly to anyone about the man his niece had married. Arthur passed away on a Tuesday evening in his home, at the age of 71. He had been managing a heart condition for several years, and his death, while deeply felt by the family, was not unexpected. The memorial service was small, the way Arthur would have wanted. Diane flew back to Columbus immediately and sat in the front row and held herself together with the composure that people who have been expecting a loss develop. A kind of practiced stillness that is not the absence of grief, but its most disciplined expression. Roland was not at the memorial service. He had a professional commitment that week, a development deal he was finalizing that he said he could not leave. Diane did not argue about it. She absorbed it, filed it in the part of her mind where she kept things she wasn't yet ready to examine, and focused on her family. She had no idea, sitting in that small funeral home in Columbus, that 3 months later her marriage would also be ending. And she had no idea that Arthur, with the same foresight he had applied to every other significant transaction in his life, had already accounted for that possibility too. The affair between Roland Mercer and Tasha Bloom had been running for 14 months before Diane discovered it. 14 months, which means that for over a year, the 2 people she trusted most in the world had been building something in the shadow of everything she believed was solid. They had been doing it through the period of Arthur's declining health. They had been doing it through the memorial service Roland had not attended. They had been doing it through Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings and the ordinary accumulation of daily life that Diane moved through with no awareness that the ground beneath it was hollow. The discovery came not from a confrontation, not from a friend's careful disclosure, but from a text message, seen by accident, on a phone left on the kitchen counter for 45 seconds while Roland was in the next room. Diane has never described the text's content in detail to anyone outside of her immediate family. What she has described is the sensation of reading it, the way it took several seconds for her brain to process what her eyes were seeing, the way the meaning arrived in stages rather than all at once, the way the name at the top of the message thread sat there like something that should not have been able to exist in that context, and yet undeniably did. Tasha. She put the phone back exactly where she found it. She walked to the other side of the kitchen. She stood at the window, the same window Roland had stood at weeks later when he told her to sign the papers, and she looked out at nothing in particular. And then she did something that revealed, more than anything else in this story, who Diane Whitfield fundamentally was. She did not confront Roland that night. She did not call Tasha. She did not fall apart in any visible way. She went to bed. For the 10 days that followed, Diane Whitfield watched her husband move through their shared life with the careful attention of a scientist observing a variable they have already identified. She tracked the pattern of his phone use, when he angled the screen away, when he left the room to take calls, when the rhythm of his typing changed from casual to deliberate. She noticed the small calibrations he made to his behavior when Tasha's name came up in conversation, the fractional pause before he responded, the studied casualness of his tone, the way he occasionally overcorrected into warmth about Tasha as though warmth itself was a disguise. She cataloged these things the way Arthur had taught her to catalog property details, not with emotion, but with precision, not as pain, but as information. She was building a picture. And by the time Roland walked to that window and told her to sign the papers, Diane already knew its every detail. The night she signed the divorce papers, Diane Whitfield did something that many people in her position would not have thought to do. She called her cousin, not to cry, though she did cry that night, privately and at length, but to ask for the name of a good attorney, not a divorce attorney, an estate attorney. Because 3 weeks before Roland handed her those papers, Gerald Okafor, The attorney who had managed Arthur Whitfield's legal affairs for over 2 decades had sent Diane a certified letter informing her that the probate process for her uncle's estate had formally begun and that she was named as a significant beneficiary. She had set the letter aside in the fog of fresh grief and had not yet followed up. She followed up that night. She did not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table long after Roland had gone upstairs, and in the quiet of a house that was no longer her home and a marriage that had already ended even before the paperwork confirmed it, she began making calls. Diane Whitfield, in the worst night of her adult life, was already working. Gerald Okafor reached Diane on her cell phone on Monday morning, exactly 72 hours after she had signed the divorce papers, at 9:14 in the morning. She was sitting in her car in the parking lot of a grocery store, having driven there without any clear memory of deciding to, unable to recall what she had needed to buy. He asked if she was somewhere she could receive information. She said she was. And over the next 22 minutes, Gerald Okafor walked her through the terms of Arthur Whitfield's estate in the measured, precise cadence of a man who had spent 40 years delivering significant financial news and had learned that what people needed in those moments was not drama but clarity. The portfolio encompassed commercial and residential properties, undeveloped land parcels, and mixed-use buildings across Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee, assembled over 30 years with the patience of someone who had never once been in a hurry to be recognized for what he was accumulating. The total appraised value of the estate, as of Arthur's death, was $650 million. Diane was the primary beneficiary, not one of several, not one of a carefully distributed list. The primary, the inheritor of everything Arthur Whitfield had spent his entire adult life building. She sat in that parking lot for a long time after the call ended. She did not call anyone. She did not cry, which surprised her. She sat with the number the way you sit with something enormous, carefully, without trying to hold all of it at once, just the edges of it, slowly. She thought about Arthur. She thought about all those Sunday phone calls, all those dinners, all those quiet conversations about patience and value and the difference between what something is worth and what someone is willing to pay for it. And she thought about the letter sitting on Roland's counter, signed and dated 3 days prior. The timing was not poetic. It was not designed. Arthur had been ill for a long time. The estate had been settled in the natural course of his affairs. But the intersection of these two events, the end of her marriage and the beginning of her inheritance, arrived within 72 hours of each other, and the effect of that convergence was something that no one involved would be able to fully calculate for months. Diane Whitfield, 3 days removed from the worst night of her life, had become one of the wealthiest private individuals in the state of Ohio, and she had not yet told a single person. The divorce moved with a speed that surprised Roland's attorney, who had been prepared for contention. Diane did not fight the terms. She accepted a clean division of the marital assets. The home was sold, proceeds split evenly, debts allocated fairly. She did not pursue alimony. She did not challenge any of the filings. She responded to every document promptly and without complaint. Her attorney, a sharp, experienced woman named Carolyn Vasquez, whom Diane had hired on Gerald Okafor's recommendation, later described the process as the most efficient divorce negotiation she had conducted in 15 years of family law practice. She knew exactly what she wanted, Vasquez would tell a colleague years later, and what she wanted was out, cleanly, completely, without leaving any part of herself behind in the process. Roland interpreted Diane's cooperation as surrender, as a woman so diminished by the end of the marriage that she lacked the energy or the resources to push back. He told at least 3 people in their social circle during this period that Diane was handling it better than expected. He said this with a quality that people who heard it would later describe, when looking back, as relief. He was relieved that she wasn't fighting. He understood her compliance as confirmation that he had assessed the situation correctly, that leaving her had been the right calculation, executed at the right time. Tasha apparently agreed. They moved into an apartment together within 6 weeks of the papers being signed, and by all external accounts Roland seemed energized by the change. Lighter, like a man who had cut loose something heavy without realizing it might have been ballast. What Roland did not know, could not have known, because Diane had told no one, was that in the weeks following the divorce, Diane Whitfield was not processing loss. She was building infrastructure. She had retained Gerald Okafor as her primary estate attorney, and brought in a wealth management firm on his recommendation. She was attending meetings, long, complex, document-heavy meetings about probate proceedings, property appraisals, title transfers, tax filings across 3 states, and the formation of the legal entities through which a portfolio of that size is most efficiently managed. The process of formally transferring $650 million in real estate assets from one name to another is not fast. It takes months of dense, careful, legally precise work. But Diane attended every meeting. She read every document. She asked questions in those meetings that made the attorneys exchange glances, the kind of questions that come from someone who has been thinking about property value their entire adult life without anyone around them noticing. She moved out of the marital home and into a temporary rental while the sale was processed. She did not decorate it. She did not make it comfortable. She treated it like a staging area, a place to sleep and work from while the larger things were sorted. People who reached out to check on her during this period described calls that felt, in retrospect, somewhat disorienting. They had expected a woman in grief. They found a woman who was focused, whose questions were forward-facing, whose responses were measured and precise. One childhood friend who called Diane during this period told a mutual acquaintance afterward, she wasn't sad. I mean, she wasn't not sad, but she was somewhere else. She was already somewhere else. And she was in the middle of one of the most significant financial transitions in Ohio that year, and she was managing it with the same quiet efficiency that Arthur Whitfield had applied to every transaction across 3 decades. She was, without announcing it, becoming what Arthur had always believed she was capable of being. In the commercial real estate world, the world Roland Mercer had spent his professional life inhabiting, information moves quickly and quietly, carried by brokers and lenders and attorneys who talk to each other constantly and who understand that a name of a certain magnitude carries weight whether its owner intends it to or not. It was inevitable, given the size of Arthur's estate and the breadth of its geographic footprint, that Diane Whitfield's name would begin circulating in professional conversations. Gerald Okafor was making quiet introductions on her behalf, not press releases, not announcements, just the careful professional courtesy of letting the relevant parties know that the Whitfield portfolio was now under new management and that inquiries should be directed accordingly. In those conversations, her last name sometimes prompted a pause. A connection made. The Whitfield portfolio. Diane Whitfield. Mercer, wasn't that? Yes. Patricia Ellison was a commercial lender who had worked with Roland Mercer professionally on 2 previous occasions and who was now being approached regarding one of Arthur's larger Columbus area properties. She was a careful woman, thorough in the way that good lenders are, and when the name Diane Whitfield appeared in the paperwork she was reviewing, she recognized it. She knew Roland. She knew, through the professional grapevine, that he and Diane had recently divorced. And she knew, from the documents in front of her, approximately what the Whitfield portfolio contained. She did not make a phone call to Roland. She did not do anything she could be accused of professionally. But in the ordinary course of conversation with a mutual broker, a conversation about market conditions, nothing specific, she mentioned the Whitfield name in a way that the broker connected, within 48 hours, to Roland's current project. Roland was, at that time, making his most significant professional move to date. He had identified a commercial development corridor in a mid-sized Ohio city, a stretch of transitional property that he believed was at the precise moment in its market cycle where entry price was still manageable and return on development was strong. He had spent months assembling financing. He had used capital from the marital home sale as part of his liquidity stake. He had brought in 2 outside investors. The deal was the largest he had ever led independently, and it represented, in his own estimation, the moment his career moved from competent to significant. He was proud of it. It was, by any objective measure, a smart piece of work, well-researched, well-structured, and positioned in a market he understood. There was only one thing Roland had not accounted for, and it was the same thing Roland had consistently failed to account for throughout the entirety of his marriage. He had not looked carefully enough at what was already there before he arrived. Because Arthur Whitfield, in the early 2000s, had acquired parcels of land in the same commercial corridor Roland was now targeting. Not the specific lot Roland was developing. Arthur's properties were adjacent. But in commercial development, adjacent is everything. Easement rights, infrastructure access, zoning buffers. the ability to expand a project beyond its initial footprint. Every one of those questions, in that corridor, ran through properties that now belonged to Diane Whitfield. Roland's attorneys discovered this during the due diligence phase, quietly at first, then with increasing urgency as they understood the scope of the intersection. They reached out to the Whitfield estate management team to open a conversation about access and cooperation. The response they received came through Gerald Okafor's office. It was professional. It was prompt. It said, essentially, that Ms. Whitfield was aware of the inquiry and that all matters related to the estate would proceed through appropriate legal channels in due course. It committed to nothing. It conceded nothing. It was, as Roland's lead attorney described it in a call with Roland that evening, a holding position from someone who knows they hold the position. Roland made the phone call the following Thursday, not through attorneys, not through intermediaries. He picked up his phone and he called Diane's cell number directly at 9:30 in the evening, and she answered. The call lasted 31 minutes. Diane has recounted its arc to several family members over the years, in the same precise sequence each time, which suggests she has thought about it carefully and decided what she wants the record to be. Roland opened with warmth, a kind of catching-up register that felt practiced, she said, like someone who had rehearsed friendliness. He moved into curiosity, expressing surprise at the scope of Arthur's estate, noting that it must be overwhelming to manage, asking questions in a way that positioned him as a helpful resource. And then, with about 10 minutes left in the call, he arrived at what he had actually called to say. He had professional expertise in real estate development. She had a portfolio that required that expertise. It would make sense, practical sense, efficient sense, logical sense, for them to work together in some capacity. He used the phrase, "what we built together," to describe their years of marriage, framing the relationship as a kind of shared professional foundation. He used the phrase, "complement each other's strengths," to describe what a partnership might look like. He spoke for several minutes without pausing, and when he finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Then Diane said, "I'll have my attorney reach out to your attorney if that's ever something worth exploring." And she ended the call. She has not spoken to Roland Mercer privately since that night. But the call mattered for a reason beyond its content, because Roland, in placing it, in using the language he used, in invoking their marriage as a professional foundation, had created a paper trail. And 3 weeks later, that paper trail would become the scaffolding of one of the most significant legal miscalculations of his professional life. Because Roland Mercer filed a claim, he argued, through 2 attorneys in a carefully drafted brief, that because Arthur Whitfield had been known to him during the marriage, had attended the wedding, had interacted with the couple across 11 years, had shared dinners in their home, the relationship that generated the inheritance had been nurtured, in part, within the context of the marriage, and that he was therefore entitled to a portion of its value. The claim drew attention. Attorneys in the Columbus estate planning community watched it with genuine interest because the argument Roland was making was not, on its face, absurd. Courts have, in narrow and specific circumstances, examined inherited assets for marital entanglement. Some of them have found it. Roland's attorneys had done their research. They built a credible brief. And for a period of several weeks, while the filing was pending and the response was being prepared, Roland apparently believed he had a real chance. He was, people close to him observed during this period, almost optimistic. He told at least one colleague that the claim was more solid than people might think. He said this with the particular confidence of someone who has convinced himself that the next deal is going to be the one that changes everything. Tasha, by multiple accounts, encouraged him. Gerald Okafor had been preparing for exactly this scenario since the estate first entered probate. Arthur's will had been drafted with the kind of explicit legal language that an attorney who had known Arthur for 20 years understood was not accidental. Language that designated the inheritance as personal and separate, that predated the marriage by years, that had been reviewed and reaffirmed through 3 subsequent updates, each of which left that core designation intact and unambiguous. There was also the correspondence, private letters and emails between Arthur and Gerald that spanned nearly a decade of the marriage, that painted an unambiguous picture of Arthur's intentions regarding Roland. And there was the letter, the one Arthur had dictated to Gerald approximately 2 years before his death, which had been sealed and held in Gerald's files precisely for a moment like this one. In that letter, Arthur Whitfield described his niece's marriage in terms that were not warm. He described Roland's professional ambition as something he had watched carefully and never fully trusted. And he wrote, in the measured, deliberate language of a man who had spent 40 years putting things precisely into words, that his estate was intended for the right hands, and only those hands, and that he had gone to considerable lengths to ensure the law reflected that intention. The judge reviewed the claim, the counterfiling, the will's history, and Arthur's correspondence over the course of 3 weeks. The ruling was delivered on a Wednesday morning, and it was complete. Roland's claim was dismissed in its entirety. He was ordered to pay a portion of Diane's legal costs related to the counterfiling. Every professional contact to whom Roland had made overtures regarding the Whitfield portfolio received formal notice that the matter had been resolved and that the estate was fully and solely under Diane Whitfield's management. Carolyn Vasquez, Diane's family law attorney, received a copy of the ruling and later said it was one of the cleaner outcomes she had seen in a complicated estate dispute. Gerald Okafor said nothing publicly. He had been Arthur Whitfield's attorney for over 20 years. He had learned discretion from the best possible teacher. Roland's development deal began showing structural problems within days of the ruling. The investors, who had been growing impatient with the delays caused by the easement and access negotiations, began asking questions about timeline that Roland could not answer. The financing structure he had assembled depended on a development schedule that the access issues had already pushed 6 months back, and 6 months, in a financing structure of that type, is the difference between manageable and critical. By the end of that quarter, 2 of his 3 outside investors had formally withdrawn. The capital they took with them exposed Roland's own stake in a way that required him to make decisions quickly, the kind of decisions that are never made well under pressure. He made them poorly. The project unwound over the course of 18 months, leaving Roland with real financial damage. Not ruin. He was not destroyed, but he was materially set back in the exact professional arena where he had placed his greatest confidence, at the exact moment when confidence was what he had least of. Tasha Bloom, meanwhile, was navigating her own version of the aftermath. She had left her apartment and moved in with Roland 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, and the early months of that arrangement had carried the particular energy that affairs always carry when they become the official relationship, the feeling of finally being allowed to exist in the open, of no longer requiring secrecy, of having won something. But the thing that is true about relationships that are built in the shadow of someone else's pain is that they tend to be sustained, for longer than they should be, by the narrative of the affair itself. What had held Roland and Tasha together for 14 months was not only attraction. It was the particular intensity of shared secrecy, of chosen transgression, of 2 people united by what they had decided to take. When the secrecy ended and the transgression became ordinary life, what was left had to carry its own weight. And increasingly, it could not. The engagement Roland announced, with a ring that multiple people in their circle described as notably large, given his circumstances, lasted 13 months. The relationship ended quietly, by most accounts. No dramatic confrontation, no public declaration. Just a gradual recognition, on both sides, that the story they had told themselves about what they were was not the story that actual daily life was willing to confirm. Tasha moved back into her own apartment. Roland remained in theirs, then moved again 6 months later. Their social circle, which had already been quietly reconfiguring itself in the years since the divorce, finished the process of separating into those who stayed with Diane, and those who stayed with Roland, and those who simply drifted away from all 3 of them, exhausted by the whole gravitational weight of it. Diane Whitfield, by the time that engagement dissolved, had completed the formal transfer of Arthur's estate into her name. She had established the management structure, a small, highly competent team of professionals she had selected carefully, mostly on Gerald Okafor's recommendations and partly on her own instinct. She had made her first independent acquisition, a residential property portfolio in eastern Kentucky that her team had flagged as significantly undervalued relative to comparable regional markets. The deal was quiet. It was executed with precision. It was profitable within 2 years. She had also made a decision, during this period, about where she wanted to live. She found a house, not large, not ostentatious, not the kind of property that announces itself, in a Columbus neighborhood she had always liked, with good light in the mornings and a garden that had been well tended by the previous owner. She bought it simply. She moved in on a Friday. She painted the kitchen herself that first weekend, which she would later describe as the most satisfying 2 days she could remember. A cousin visited her in that house about 4 months after she moved in, and they sat in that kitchen with coffee and talked for a long time about everything that had happened. The cousin, who had been close to Diane throughout the divorce and the estate proceedings and all of it, asked her what the strangest part of the whole experience had been. Diane thought about it for a long moment. She said the strangest part was how little time she had spent thinking about Roland. Not because she had suppressed it. She was clear about that. She had done the work. She had sat with the grief of it. She had let herself feel everything that needed to be felt. But the work had been so consuming and so genuinely interesting to her, and so precisely suited to everything she had always been at her core, that the grief had been crowded out. Not erased, but given less room than she might have expected. Arthur always said that real estate teaches patience, she told her cousin. But it teaches you something else too. It teaches you that the value of something is almost never visible on the surface, and that most people who lose what they have lose it because they stopped paying attention. They thought they already knew the answer. They stopped looking. She paused. The kitchen was quiet. The light from the garden window was coming in the way she had specifically positioned the table to catch it. And then she said something that her cousin has repeated many times in the years since, to different people in different contexts, because it is the sentence that makes the story make sense. She said, "Roland thought I was the least valuable thing in the room. He calculated that every single day for 11 years. And he was wrong every single day. The tragedy isn't what he did to me. The tragedy is how long he had access to something extraordinary and never once understood what he was looking at. That is the thing about value. The people who understand it most profoundly are almost never the loudest ones in the room. They're the ones who have been paying attention for years, to the numbers, to the patterns, to the parts of things that don't announce themselves." Arthur Whitfield understood this. He built $650 million on this understanding, and he left it, deliberately and precisely, to the one person he had watched practicing the same skill her entire life. Roland Mercer spent 11 years in a house with that person. He held the papers that made her his family. He sat across from Arthur Whitfield at dinner and shook his hand and said he would take care of her. And then, when he decided he was done, he handed her the papers that set her free. 3 days later, Diane Whitfield inherited everything. So here is the question I want to leave you with tonight. And I want you to sit with it, not for a second, but for a minute. I want you to actually think about it before you scroll past. Was this a story about luck? About a woman who happened to have an uncle who happened to die at exactly the right moment, and whose timing happened to line up with the worst weekend of her life in a way that rescued her? Or was this a story about something that was always going to happen, because of who Diane was, because of what Arthur saw in her, because of the consistency of her character across every season of her life, including the hardest one? I think you already know what I believe. I think the people who want to call this luck are the same people who would have looked at Arthur's unimpressive sedan and his corduroy jacket and his modest neighborhood and decided he had nothing worth paying attention to. They would have been wrong about Arthur. They were wrong about Diane. And somewhere, in some version of the life he is currently living, Roland Mercer understands, on some level, how completely and specifically he was wrong. What do you think? Tell me in the comments. Was this luck? Or was this always the outcome character was going to produce? I read every single comment on this channel, and I want to know where you land on that question. And if you are somewhere in your own life right now where you have been told, by someone's actions or someone's words or someone's simple decision to look past you, that you are the least valuable thing in the room, I want you to hear this clearly. They are working with incomplete information. Stay patient. Stay precise. Stay focused on what you're building, even when no one around you can see it yet. Arthur saw it in Diane from the time she was a little girl asking him questions at the dinner table. The right people will see it in you too. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, if you found yourself rooting for Diane at any point in the last hour, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Hit the like button if you believe that character is more powerful than circumstance. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next story drops, because I promise you, what we have coming will sit with you in the same way this one did. We are just getting started. And until next time, pay attention to the quiet ones. They are almost always the ones worth watching.